Here's a question nobody in the silo is allowed to ask out loud. If a rulebook has an answer for absolutely everything, from elevators to eyeglasses to who's allowed to fall in love, is it really there to keep you safe? Or is safety just the word they printed on the cover? That's the show we're taking apart today. Not the plot, not who killed who, the actual rulebook, the Pact. Every clause, every silence, every strange little law that sounds like bureaucracy until you sit with it for 10 seconds too long. Stick around, because by the end of this, you're going to watch every future episode of this show completely differently. Let's get into it. Every resident of the silo learns one rule before almost anything else. Never say you want to go outside. Say it, and the door opens. You get exactly what you asked for, and it kills you within minutes. On paper, that's a survival law. The air outside is toxic, so don't beg to breathe it. Simple. Except watch how people actually react when someone breaks it. They don't just disagree. They flinch. They step back. Sometimes they report their own neighbor before anyone in judicial even asks a question. That's not fear of toxic air. Nobody in that crowd is thinking about atmospheric chemistry in that moment. That's fear of each other. And a rule that trains an entire population to police each other's speech doesn't need many enforcers, because the crowd does the job for free. There's a strange little escape hatch built into this law too. Technically, if you think your request to leave was a misunderstanding, you can ask for a hearing. In practice, nobody has ever walked away from that hearing still breathing silo air. It exists so the system can say, we gave them a chance, without ever having to actually give anyone a chance. That's not justice. That's paperwork wearing justice's clothes. And that single rule is really just the headline. Underneath it sits a much longer list most viewers scroll right past. So let's not scroll past it. Let's go floor by floor. Start with something that sounds almost boring. There is no elevator in the silo. No lift, no pulley system, nothing mechanized to move people between levels. 144 floors, and every single resident gets there the same way. On foot, up one long spiral staircase. The official reasoning is resource conservation. Fewer moving parts, less maintenance, less to break down over generations. Fine, but think about what that actually does to a society over time. Someone born near the top of that staircase might live their entire life without meeting someone born near the bottom. The trip takes real days. Most people can't spare that kind of time, so they simply don't take it. One of the show's most quietly devastating details is a security officer casually admitting she has no idea what people at the bottom of the silo even eat for dinner. Not because she doesn't care, because the architecture of her own home made it physically impossible to find out. That's not an accident of engineering. A population that can't easily move, can't easily compare notes, can't easily organize, and can't easily respond fast when something goes wrong. Any emergency response in that world moves at walking pace, no matter how urgent the emergency actually is. Now pair that with a second rule. Owning a private radio is a serious violation for ordinary citizens. Distance already keeps people apart. A radio would erase that distance instantly, so it gets banned too. 144 levels that can't move fast is hard to organize. 144 levels that also can't talk to each other instantly is nearly impossible to organize. That's probably not a coincidence. That might be the entire point, that here's a rule that sounds almost too specific to matter. Magnification beyond a certain strength is banned. No real microscopes, nothing sharper than an ordinary magnifying glass. Build a stronger one, and you've committed a direct violation, no matter how harmless your intentions were. Why would anyone bother legislating something that oddly precise? Because strong magnification lets you actually read old objects clearly. Fine print, tiny manufacturing stamps, engineering details, the kind of small evidence that could tell you a lot more about the world before the silo than the official story wants floating around. Blur the tools, and you blur the history. Nobody has to burn a library if nobody can read the fine print anymore. And it's worth noticing who seems to get quiet exceptions to that rule. Certain trusted specialists appear to read fine structural detail with a level of precision an ordinary resident never gets access to. If that's true, it isn't a loophole in the system. It's the system working exactly as designed. Deciding who gets sharper eyes than everyone else is its own quiet form of control. That leads directly into the next rule, and this one might be the most chilling piece of legal architecture in the entire show. Owning a relic, any object from before the silo, is illegal outright. Confiscated the second judicial finds it. Predictable, for a world this obsessed with controlling its own history. Here's the part that tends to slide by. It's not just illegal to own one. It's illegal to know someone else owns one and stay quiet about it. A character gets sent to the mines specifically for failing to report someone else's relic, not for owning one himself. Sit with that for a second. That clause doesn't just punish curiosity. It turns every single resident into an informant, without a single one of them ever putting on a badge. You don't need judicial watching everyone at all times if the law already requires everyone to watch each other, and fear is heavy enough to make sure they actually do it. To be fair, that same dense rulebook occasionally bites back the other way. When someone in power tries to sideline the sheriff without following proper protocol, they get outmaneuvered by their own bureaucracy, arrested for violating the exact procedural rules they were counting on. A rule book this detailed is mostly a weapon for whoever already holds power. Every so often, though, someone who understands it just as well turns that same density against them. Rare. Not the norm, but real, and worth giving credit for. Health gets folded into control just as tightly and nowhere more clearly than with a condition the show simply calls the syndrome. Symptoms include twitching, tremors, and worsening balance. Anyone who develops it is legally required to report it immediately and to surrender any position of authority they hold the moment they do. One deputy hides his condition for exactly that reason, because admitting it ends his career instantly, even while he keeps proving, case after case, that his judgment hasn't slipped at all. On the surface, that reads as basic safety. You don't want someone whose body might fail them holding a position where lives depend on their steadiness. In practice, it's something far more useful to a controlling system. It lets that system remove a person from power without ever having to prove their judgment has actually failed. The body disqualifies the mind, whether or not the mind still works perfectly well. That makes it one of the only rules in the entire Pact that punishes a condition instead of a choice. And once you notice that pattern, you start seeing it everywhere else on this list too. Sometimes rules alone don't produce the reaction a system needs fast enough, and this show actually accounts for that possibility directly. The Silo's founders apparently left behind a specific playbook for exactly that scenario, referred to on screen simply as the Order. It gets used to stage a manufactured crisis and later to pin a murder on an entire department in order to turn public anger toward a group of people who had nothing to do with it. One of the judges recognizes the method instantly for what it is, because she's smart enough to see the pattern underneath the panic. Think about what that means structurally. A system that already has a written rule for nearly everything still keeps a separate, unwritten playbook for the moments its existing rules can't quite manufacture the outcome it wants. That's not a safety net. That's a contingency plan for public opinion itself. And it's worth noticing which department gets framed. The people trusted to keep the generator running are, by the Pact's own rules on infrastructure, already treated as the most dangerous people in the entire silo the instant something goes wrong nearby. The blame doesn't need much convincing. The suspicion was already built in ahead of time. Relationships get their own quiet layer of control long before anyone even reaches motherhood. The Pact recognizes certain partnerships as officially sanctioned and treats everyone else as though the relationship barely exists in the eyes of the law. One of the show's central romances carries almost no legal weight at all, despite meaning everything to the people inside it. Sanctioning isn't just this world's version of marriage. It's an earlier checkpoint in the same system that eventually decides who's approved to have children, because deciding who officially counts as a couple is the natural first step before deciding which couples get permission to reproduce at all. Motherhood carries the strictest version of that same control, and the actual language used is worth sitting with. Mothers are described as vessels for delivering children into the world, the same word used to describe the silo itself as a vessel for its people. Having a child at all requires winning a lottery, with birth control removed only for a limited window if approval comes through. That's usually framed as simple resource management, and in a sealed environment with finite food and space, that reasoning isn't entirely wrong. But one character says something sharper. She points out that the system only wants docile, obedient citizens, and that someone with her temperament would never be approved to become a parent in the first place. That reframes the entire lottery. It's not just capping population size. It's filtering personality across generations, deciding which kind of person gets to become a parent at all, and which kind quietly doesn't. That filtering apparently starts even earlier than adulthood. Every girl is reportedly brought to a specific ritual around age 11, described in official language as necessary for the population's long-term well-being. The exact mechanics aren't fully spelled out on screen, so it's fair to be upfront about that gap rather than fill it with guesswork. But the placement and the wording both point toward the same reproductive control the lottery already confirms. It's very likely the moment a default form of birth control gets installed in every girl, long before she'd ever be old enough to apply for permission herself, that a few smaller rules round out the list, and they're easy to miss precisely because they sound so administrative. Judges can only be removed from power for proven misconduct, an inability to do the job, or genuinely endangering the silo. Notice what's missing from that list. There's no clause about a judge simply being wrong, unpopular, or making an unpopular call. The bar for removing someone that powerful is deliberately narrow, which protects the person holding the position far more than it protects the people under their authority. Then there's the pair of rules that sound almost too boring to matter. Every citizen must maintain current knowledge of emergency procedures at all times. Every citizen is also personally responsible for attending mandatory health screenings and using whichever recreational facilities they're assigned. Neither sounds sinister in isolation. Together, they hand the state a standing, permission-based reason to check in on any resident's body and behavior on a regular schedule. No separate justification required each time they do it. Even the visible government sitting on top of all this isn't quite what it looks like. Residents believe their mayor and judge run the silo, and they vote accordingly. But they're only ever choosing between candidates the visible system decides to put in front of them in the first place. The real authority, tied to a vault and whatever algorithm operates beneath it, sits entirely outside anything a resident ever gets to weigh in on. Nobody needs to be told the vote is symbolic for the system to work. People just need to believe they already had their say, which makes them far less likely to go looking for whoever's actually running things underneath. None of this stays fixed either, and that might be the most unsettling part of the whole structure. One of the show's most devoted rule followers spends part of this season quietly rewriting sections of the Pact himself. A rulebook that gets edited by whoever's currently enforcing. It isn't a fixed inheritance passed down from wiser founders. It's a living tool, shaped by whoever happens to be holding the pen. The fact that the person editing it right now has believed in it completely for his entire career only shows how easily belief bends the moment bending it becomes convenient. Then there's the category of rule that isn't written anywhere at all, and just quietly reveals itself if you're paying attention. Pets don't exist in this world. No dogs, no cats, nothing kept purely for company. The one animal that appears on screen shows up strictly for a medical procedure, not as anyone's companion. Nobody explains this as an official law the way transportation or magnification get explained, so it's fair to call it an absence rather than a confirmed rule. But in a world where having a single child requires a lottery and a permit, an animal that eats food and drinks water without producing anything in return simply doesn't fit the math. Nobody needed to legislate that. The resource logic already decided it long before anyone had to write it down. Food and water follow that same unwritten logic. Nothing in the Pact spells out exact rations the way it spells out staircases and magnifying glasses. But every glimpse of daily life assumes tight, careful control over both, because a sealed structure holding thousands of people for centuries was never going to leave something that basic to chance. Nearly all of this traces back to one specific moment in the silo's history. A rebellion happened roughly a century and a half before the story we're watching, and the crackdown that followed didn't just erase old records. That's when this exact version of the Pact, tight, detailed, covering everything from staircases to 11-year-olds, actually took its current shape. Before that crackdown, uprisings reportedly happened roughly every 20 years. After it, silence held for more than a century straight. That's worth pausing on because it tells you these rules aren't random paranoia. They're a direct, engineered response to a specific historical failure, refined over generations until the system finally found a version stable enough to hold. Line every one of these rules up next to each other, and the pattern stops being subtle. The staircase and the radio band keep levels from ever talking to each other, more than they save on maintenance costs. The magnification band keeps history manageable rather than protecting any real equipment. The relic law makes sure nobody assembles a clear picture of the world before the silo, while quietly turning every resident into their own neighbor's enforcer. The syndrome rule disqualifies people by body instead of by judgment. The order gives the system a manufactured crisis on demand, for the moments its existing rules aren't producing the reaction it needs fast enough. Sanctioning, the birth lottery, and that early ritual all shape the population's size and temperament, dressed up in language that sounds closer to tradition than administration. Even a judge's narrow impeachment clause protects the chair more than the people sitting beneath it. And the animals nobody mentions trace back to the exact same arithmetic as everything else. Every rule on this list is doing one of two jobs at all times. It either controls what people are allowed to know, or it controls how many people there are, who they're allowed to become, and what resources they're allowed to spend staying alive. That's the real shape of the Pact once you stop reading it as a safety manual. It's a set of dials for keeping a closed system small, obedient, and easy to manage, wrapped in language solemn enough that nobody stops to ask why a rule about elevators would ever need to exist in the first place. That here's why this matters right now, and not just as a fun rewatch exercise. This world comes from Hugh Howey's original trilogy, and the show's current season pulls directly from the second book, which jumps back roughly 3 centuries to the actual construction of the silo system. That means we're not just watching characters break these rules anymore. We're about to watch the exact meeting where somebody decided these rules were necessary in the first place, and had to convince a room full of people to agree with them. The present-day storyline is picking up with its central engineer surviving her exile, only to come back changed and missing pieces of her own memory, right as the silo tries to rebuild after open rebellion. Meanwhile, centuries earlier, a journalist and a young congressman start pulling on a thread that eventually leads to the very origin of this entire system. And the show is framing that half of the story less like science fiction and more like a political thriller. That's the real reason this rulebook deserves a second look. Every clause we just walked through wasn't written by some faceless bureaucracy for no reason. Somebody, in a room, centuries ago, made a calculated decision that control was worth this price. And the show is finally about to show us that room.s. Here's the actual question worth sitting with after all this. Every closed system eventually has to choose between trusting its people with the truth or managing them with rules dense enough that nobody notices the difference. The silo chose the second option, and it worked for 140 years of silence. Which rule on this list did you think was just background noise before today? Drop it in the comments, because I guarantee at least one of you is about to rewatch an old episode and catch something you missed the first time. If this kind of breakdown is your thing, subscribe, because we're going floor by floor through this world every time new episodes land. Thanks for sticking around all the way to the bottom level. I'll see you in the next one.